Let me tell you, when a game starts to feel like it's not just between two teams but also against the referees, you know something's wrong. In a high-stakes moment, star defensive lineman Will Anderson Jr. spoke out, claiming it's not just the Chiefs they're up against, it's the refs, too. And this wasn't some small complaint. It was about key penalties that could have completely changed the game's momentum. So, what happens when the line between fairness and frustration starts to disappear in the heat of competition? Stay with me, because what went down in that game is something you'll want to hear about. There are moments in every season when the story shifts. It's no longer just about the score. It's about the unseen forces at play, the decisions that aren't made by the players but by the referees in those black and white stripes standing on the sideline. This past Saturday, we saw something unfold that was more than missed tackles or missed opportunities. It was about the power of officiating, how those calls can control the rhythm, the pace, and even the outcome of the game. And when a player like Will Anderson Jr., a star who's got fire in his belly, says it's us versus the refs, you know there's more to the story. The Kansas City Chiefs and the Houston Texans squared off in a game that was supposed to be all about the competition, but tensions were high and tempers were flaring. Anderson, a player who had every reason to be frustrated after a penalty, called it as he saw it. It wasn't just the Texans against the Chiefs, it was the Texans fighting the officials too. This wasn't just about a game, it was about control. Anderson's roughing the passer penalty wasn't just another call, it was a game-changing moment that had fans buzzing, questioning whether... The referees, it turns out, got it right. The ball was snapped, the play unfolded, and just like that, a flag was thrown during what seemed like a routine incomplete pass from Patrick Mahomes to Travis Kelce. But this wasn't just any penalty. This was a roughing the passer call, and it wasn't your typical mistake. It had all the hallmarks of a controversial decision. Referee Clay Martin, the man who threw the flag, stood firm in his explanation. He said that the contact with Mahomes' face mask was enough to warrant the penalty. But Anderson didn't agree. Oh no, he didn't think the hit on Mahomes was hard enough to deserve a flag. And let's be clear, when someone like Anderson, a top defensive lineman in the league, speaks out like this, it's not just a small complaint. This is a serious accusation. After the game, Anderson made it clear we knew it was going to be us versus the refs. Let that sink in for a moment. When you step onto the field already thinking you're up against the officials as much as the other team, something's not right. But here's the thing. Anderson wasn't just venting out of frustration. He was speaking from experience. He's a player who's seen it all. He understands how fragile the balance is between playing the game and how the decisions from the men in stripes can change everything. But now we have to ask ourselves, was the call really that wrong? Walt Anderson, the NFL's senior VP of officiating, certainly didn't think so. He backed up the referee's decision, saying that when defenders make face-to-face contact with the quarterback, the officials are likely to throw a flag if there's any contact to the quarterback's head or neck. When defenders come in and make face-to-face contact with the quarterback's head, that's probably going to be flagged, said Walt Anderson. And I get it. This is a call that's up for interpretation. Some might argue the hit wasn't strong enough to justify a penalty, while others will say it was exactly the kind of contact the league is trying to prevent. Here's the bottom line. The NFL is all about consistency. They have rules in place to protect quarterbacks, and when those rules are possibly broken, the flag gets thrown. But it's not just about the initial hit. There's a bigger conversation here about whether the contact was truly forceful enough to be a penalty. Anderson didn't think so. What's really telling, though, is that this call was made in real time, in the heat of the moment, with referees trying to enforce a rulebook that's meant to protect players. We can argue about how severe the hit was all day, but at the end of the day, the officials had a job to do, and they did it. But, this wasn't the only controversial play in the game. Anderson also spoke up about a late hit on Mahomes during a slide, a moment when Mahomes' helmet made contact with the Texans' defender. This wasn't just any late hit. This was unnecessary roughness at its finest. Anderson was firm in saying this penalty, where a Texans player was flagged for hitting Mahomes after he was already on the ground, was completely justified. Now, I know what you're thinking. Can't replay help fix this? Shouldn't the officials be able to review the play to make sure the hit was really unnecessary? Well, here's the catch. The NFL's position is clear on this. If you make that kind of contact, it's a foul, and no replay is going to change that. There's no gray area here. The call was made, and it wasn't going to be overturned. You could hear the frustration in Anderson's voice as he described that play, and honestly, I get it. These are the moments that can change the course of a game. One penalty, one flag, one missed call, it can completely shift the momentum, and in the heat of the moment, those decisions can feel like a personal attack. But let's take a step back. Let's think about what all of this really means. Is it a conspiracy? Is it really us versus the refs? Or is it simply the reality of playing in a game where the margins are razor thin and every decision is magnified under the bright lights of the NFL? The bottom line is this. As much as we might want to criticize and second-guess the referees, the NFL is backing their officials. They're standing by their call, and maybe, just maybe, this is a lesson in the fine line between frustration and fairness. The NFL has made it clear they're going to err on the side of caution when it comes to player safety, even if it ruffles a few feathers along the way. Now, don't get me wrong, I completely understand the frustration of players like Will Anderson. I really do. These calls can be maddening, and in the heat of the moment, it's easy to feel like the officials are working against you. But at the end of the day, what matters more? Is it the immediate reaction of the players, or is it the long-term goal of protecting the health and safety of the quarterbacks, who are the faces of this league? Now, here's where the story takes a turn. This isn't just about a single penalty deciding a game. No, this is much bigger. It's about perception, the way the game is played, the way it's officiated, and how the very foundation of the sport starts to unravel when players feel like they've been wronged. And I'm not just talking about one or two players here. I'm talking about a system that's meant to protect. The stars of the game are supposed to be protected to keep them safe, preserve their health, and maintain the integrity of the sport. But here's the catch. What happens when that protection starts to feel more like a cage? What happens when the rules meant to keep players safe start to feel like they're holding them back from making plays? That's where the conversation begins to shift. This isn't just about one penalty or one game. No, this is about the direction the NFL is headed. Let's take a closer look at what happened when Anderson was flagged. This wasn't just a routine call. This was a moment that could have changed everything. We're talking about one of the toughest defenders in the league, Will Anderson, being penalized for roughing the passer. And honestly, it felt like the refs were making a statement. This wasn't just about that game. It was about the overall philosophy behind the NFL's rules designed to protect quarterbacks, but now starting to feel like they're suffocating defenders. Anderson wasn't just upset about one call. He was calling out a whole system he felt had turned against him and his teammates. But here's the problem. In today's NFL, where player safety is the #1 priority, the rules tend to favor the quarterbacks. And it's hard to blame the league for this. After all, quarterbacks are the faces of the franchise. They drive the ratings and make the game exciting. But when a defensive lineman like Anderson gets penalized for what feels like a minor mistake, when he's just trying to do his job, you have to wonder if the balance has shifted too far in favor of the offense. These penalties don't just affect the score, they have real-world consequences for the players who have to deal with them. Anderson didn't hold back when he talked about the roughing the passer penalty. Anderson wasn't just complaining about one bad break. He was talking about a bigger issue that defenders have been facing for years. The rules are constantly changing. The referees are under more scrutiny than ever. And yet, the pressure to deliver big hits and make game-changing plays is still there. Defenders are expected to stop elite quarterbacks without making contact to their head or neck, without crossing that line that could result in a penalty. And let me tell you, that's a tough job. We're talking about 300-pound men, running full speed, trying to tackle someone just as fast, moving at the same speed. and they have to do all of this without making what the officials might consider an illegal hit. The NFL has gone to great lengths to create rules to protect quarterbacks, and we've seen how roughing the passer penalties are enforced, and how defensive players are taught to avoid hitting the quarterback's head. But here's the question: how far are they willing to take it? At what point does enforcing these rules interfere with the very essence of the game? Defensive players like Anderson don't get to decide how these rules are enforced. They don't get to choose if a penalty should be called or not. All they can do is play the game the way they've been trained, hoping the officials are on their side. And while we're talking about penalties, let's not forget the unnecessary roughness call on a Texans defender for hitting Mahomes late during a slide. That's another example where things got murky. Anderson made it clear that this wasn't just a minor infraction. It was textbook foul play. The defender made contact with Mahomes while he was sliding, and whether that contact was light or heavy, the penalty was called. There was no going back. Anderson was right. This type of play isn't reviewable by replay assist. The call was made, and the officials weren't about to change it. But here's the thing I find most interesting. The NFL is always striving for consistency. They want the officials to make the right calls every time. They want players to know what to expect when they step onto the field. But when it comes to these kinds of penalties, it feels like the league is in the middle of a transition. They're trying to strike a balance between protecting players and maintaining the integrity of the game. It's a fine line, and it's becoming harder and harder to walk as the years go by. What's fascinating about this debate is that it's not just about one game or one team. It's a conversation that affects the entire league. When players like Anderson speak out and challenge the referees over what they see as questionable calls, it sparks a much larger discussion about the future of the game. Are the rules working? Are they too soft on quarterbacks? Or are they doing enough to protect the players who put their bodies on the line every week? In the end, it's not just about one penalty or one game. It's about a much bigger issue: the NFL's commitment to fairness, consistency, and player safety. These calls, these moments of controversy, reflect the ever-evolving nature of the game. And while not everyone may agree with the decisions made on the field, the league is standing by its officials. And you know what? They might be right, because at the end of the day, the game is about more than just the players on the field. It's about the integrity of the sport itself. So, let's be clear. There's more to this story than just the Chiefs and the Texans. It's more than just penalties. This is about the future of the NFL, how the game will be played, officiated, and understood for years to come. And you'd better believe this conversation is far from over.